Yes, sir.
So as we start in on Mark 14, it immediately jumps into this time frame and this season of the Passover. So without going in deep, without going in depth, because that is not um, the main focus of the lesson, I do want to cover some points so we have some idea of what the Passover looks like. The Passover is a commemoration of God's deliverance of the people of Israel way back when they were in Egyptian subjection or bondage. Is way back in Exodus 12. And part of that deliverance involved some plagues, and part of the latter end of those plagues was that God sent a destroyer or a death angel to kill the firstborn of a lot of folks in the area of Egypt. Well, the Passover is a celebration of God's choosing to pass over his people while that death angel was moving throughout the area and killing off certain folks. And in Exodus 12, what you'll find is that the commemoration of the Passover involves a killing of a certain lamb, a lamb without blemish, a lamb that is to be actually kept in the home for something like 4 days. And that lamb is killed. And when that lamb is killed, before it's eaten, the blood of that lamb was to be put on the doorposts of God's chosen people at the time. And the blood on the doorpost was a sign to the destroyer that moved through on a certain time that do not harm or touch anybody inside the house. As long as the blood was on the doorpost, the destroyer, the death angel, moved on and did not affect anybody in that home. Well, because this was part of the God's deliverance of the people of Israel, that is to say, the Jews of the time, they commemorated this by instruction by God, and they commemorated this by killing a lamb on a certain day. And afterward, for 7 days, they did not eat bread with leaven or yeast in it. And so in Jesus' time, when he walked the earth, Jews were still, and do still even in 2021, they commemorated this special time. And the commemoration of the Passover is the setting in which we find Jesus in Mark 14. So there are some parallels that I won't get too far into. What do I spend about 2-ish minutes on this thus far? Just remember, as Jesus is about to be killed, we are nearing the time when the commemorative season of Passover would dictate that a lamb was to be killed that first day, killed, eaten, and the blood spread on the entryway, the posts of God's people to avoid their own death. Remember this in 1 Corinthians 5:7, that parallel is highlighted. 1 Corinthians 5:7 reads as follows. It says, "Purge out therefore the old leaven." That means get the leaven out of there. Kind of reminds you of that 7-day period of not eating leaven that's attached to the Passover meal. It says, "Purge out therefore the old leaven," 1 Corinthians 5:7. It goes on to say, "that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened, for even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us." So that's where we're going to start heading into Mark 14. That actually covers Mark 14, the first two verses. Um, the first two verses indicate that there was a feast happening and that the people that wanted Jesus dead, because it was a special time for the Jews, what they did know was they wanted to set Jesus up, they wanted to trap him, they wanted to have him killed after having him arrested, but they knew they couldn't do it at this particular season because this is a holy and sacred season to the Jews. They knew if they did something like this, the people might go off. We're talking mobs, tremendous backlash. Well, as we move into verses 3 through 9 of Mark, we start to get something like a time frame and or a place. We see that Bethany was a place in which Jesus would resort to during this time when Jesus and his disciples got near Jerusalem. Why did they get near Jerusalem? Because it was time for the Passover. The Passover, or the Feast of Passover, also called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this was something that would have Jews get near Jerusalem because they were supposed to eat that Passover feast inside the city limits of Jerusalem. And so as you do some looking throughout the different gospels, you'll find that Jesus and his disciples in John 12, they neared Bethany around about 6 days before the Passover. And we find that they're getting into Bethany, and some of the events we'll see here are happening 2 days before Passover. So this is all preceding the Passover feast. In looking at verses 3 through 9 of Mark 14, we see that Jesus is in a home of a guy called Simon the leper, and he's in the city of Bethany, or the village of Bethany. Let me see if I can work the share screen action today. Boom, there we go. All right, so now we've shared screen. What we see is the city of Jerusalem inside this circle I'm drawing with my mouse cursor. And then we'll see this Garden of Gethsemane here. And the Garden of Gethsemane appears to be on the western side of this mountainous area called the Mount of Olives. And east of this Mount of Olives and east of the city of Jerusalem, we have the city of Bethany that is farther kind of off our screen there, but it's close. And of course, we got to be close to the city of Jerusalem because we're nearing the time of the Passover. Well, in the city of Bethany, or the village of Bethany, a guy named Simon the leper, he's hosting Jesus for a particular meal. And a woman that we'll find is actually Mary, sister to Lazarus, comes and she does this thing where she breaks in a vial, or an alabaster box as it's called, full of spikenard. Now, I had no idea what spikenard was the first time I heard of this. But if you were to just do a quick Google search, you'll find that spikenard is considered an essential oil nowadays. It's one of those oils that is used in aromatherapy. So we know it's extremely fragrant. Some of the uses for spikenard oil are curing of dandruff, curing of athlete's foot, curing of migraines by smelling it, or curing of depression. So in between the fragrance of spikenard and the effects that the spikenard oil has whenever it's applied to someone's skin or body, it is an oil that is worth using for aromatherapy. That's even today. And so we also know that it's super fragrant because, in other texts we found that the fragrance kind of filled the place. And it has a kind of double use in that way. What's most important here as we look at this is that it's super valuable, like it's precious, or it's expensive. As we're looking at Mark chapter 14, verses 3 through 9, we see that it's at least 300 pence worth that was used at this time to anoint Jesus by this particular woman. Now, of course, as we're moving through the Mark 14 study, we approach this Bible study with the same presumption that we've approached all of our Bible studies, and that is that you've read the chapter already. And you read the chapter, then you know that this woman, she anoints Jesus with this spikenard, this extremely precious oil worth at least 300 pence. John 12 tells us that it was like a pound of it. And 300 pence, if you think about it, with a pence being a day's salary, 300 pence, 65 short, that's, somewhere near a year's salary worth of essential oils. So it was a lot of money being used here. And obviously there are folks on standby watching this, and they had some issues. If you read the text, and I'm sure you do. And part of their argument was that this tremendous use of oil, tremendous by virtue of it being so valuable, this use of oil with all this value that was used to anoint Jesus at the time, could have been used to sell off the essential oil and feed the poor. That is the argument that was said out loud. Well, Jesus responds in saying that, first of all, the poor you're going to have with you all the time. So having the poor with you at all times, do good to them at any other time. But Jesus knew that he was only going to be on earth for a short time. And so him being here in such a temporary way at the time, it kind of rated a special treatment of him. And this oil was to be used for him. And then Jesus says that she's doing this, she's anointing me for my burial. So Jesus had a certain regard for this action and a certain regard for the woman. She's recognized by Jesus as one who has done something worth remembering throughout the entirety of time and at least every iteration in which the gospel is preached. Jesus says in verse 9 of Mark 14, wherever or wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she has done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her. Now, some other notes that you may have come across are those in John chapter 12, where we find that Mary, the one who anointed Jesus in this instance, is the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Yes, Lazarus that Jesus raised from the dead. It's that guy's sister. As a matter of fact, we find that in Matthew and John that Lazarus was there. Lazarus saw this thing happen. That's correct. The resurrected Lazarus saw this happen. And we find that at the time Mary's weeping whenever Lazarus was dead and before he was risen in John, what happens is Jesus was so loving toward this family of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus that whenever Mary began to weep and said, if you were here, my brother had not died, that is one of the two verses that immediately precedes the shortest verse in the Bible, where it's documented that Jesus wept. So Jesus knew these people and well, he loved them. And so his relationship with Mary was, it was pretty tight. It was not a, tacit relationship. So Mary anoints Jesus. We should note as students of this study that the instance in Luke chapter 7, verse 36 through 50 is a different instance. That does not necessarily say that these were different people that anointed Jesus, but if you'll check out the account of Luke 7, verses 36 through 50, where a certain woman forgiven of sins rubs Jesus' feet with her hair and breaks open an alabaster box, that is a different instance, and it's obvious in Luke 7, 36 through 50 that that's a different instance because you can see that the events surrounding him don't match the events that we're discussing in Mark 14. The parallel accounts of this anointing of Jesus' feet from Mark 14 are reflected in John 12 and in Matthew 26, verses 1 through 12. So let's go into our study book and let's look at a question with regard to this. Back into our study book on page number 76.
Hey, excuse me 1 second. I just posted these pages on the Ironmen group for those who don't have the book today, so you can use it. Just pull it up from the Ironmen WhatsApp group. One quick question, Brother Harris. So this woman that was at Simon's house and that washed her hair with the tears and on Jesus's feet, is that the same person as this Mary, or is that a different Mary or a different person?
So I looked at it, and there's not evidence that I've seen that it is a different woman. It is assumed because it's a different instance that it's a different woman. It's clear it's a different instance, but it is not clear that it is a different woman. A lot of people say it's a different woman. I have not seen proof it's a different woman. I have seen proof it's a different instance.
Yeah, I don't know either, and that's why I'm asking. Another thing that the question is, would that have been Mary Magdalene that was doing that at Simon's house? That's another question that I've often had.
I would have to look at, matter of fact, I'll write it down because I don't want to say a question or say an answer to something I have not researched for sure. But yeah, I'll write it down and please allow me to get back to you. As a matter of fact, I should probably post it in the Ironman group. I'll make a note. Is your question about Luke 7 or is it Mark 14?
I'm talking about Mary Magdalene and the woman who wiped Jesus's feet because her tears had fallen. Yes, that one.
I will double check.
Thank you.
Mary Magdalene from memory was the woman that was forgiven sins from Luke 7. And so I'll double check and see if that's the same one from Mark 14.
And minister, don't worry. You could keep it your pace and everything going. I'm gonna write everything down.
Okay. Very well. So on page 75, no, say 76. Page 76 of our study book. If I could have a participant read the question and then a different participant read the answer. After that, we'll move into our next section.
Talk about the
Okay,
first
sir.
question, Minister Harris.
Oh, yes, I should probably clarify. The question, the second question, the question that starts, a denarius was a day's wage.
Okay.
Okay. A denarius was a day's wage for a worker. So when the woman, probably Mary, the sister of Lazarus, in Mark 14, verses 3 through 9, breaks an alabaster jar and pours over Jesus' head nard worth more than 300 denarii, she is squandering almost a year's salary for a worker. Despite the protests of some who were there, Jesus does not object to this, to what this woman has done. Why not?
Can I answer or?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Okay, so couple reasons. One is, as he answers later, to whom much is forgiven, much is appreciated, and they want to do a lot. Another thing is Jesus, although he is God, and he's not proud. He knows it was a worthy worship, and she was really worshiping God. It wasn't like she was worshiping a human being, and she did that in homage. Now, if we would go and do that with somebody, that might look a little crazy, because that could be considered like worship, and that would be, sacrilegious. Another thing is, we can see from the Old Testament, Mordecai, he would not bow down to Haman. So, this woman, being a Jew, would not bow down to anybody unless it was somebody worth worshiping, or somebody worth giving that much homage to. And something interesting that he says later on in the chapter also is, wherever the gospel is preached, this incident must be mentioned as a memorial. And there he shows how not only was this expensive thing that was um, poured out before God and before Jesus, it was a true worship. It was a genuine act of gratitude from forgiveness, and a genuine repentance with the tears that was spilled on the feet of Jesus. Am I mixing the two Marys now? Or sometimes I get them
Yes,
mixed
sir.
up.
Yes,
But
sir.
anyway, that's my answer.
And correct, it comes down to the act of getting low, tracking. In addition, what is said here is that she's anointing his body for the bearing. What I haven't heard, and what we should remember, was that at the time, remember, Jesus was placed in a tomb. Lazarus was placed in a tomb. And so these are clues that at the time, what they did with dead bodies, um, what they did with dead bodies of special people, was they put them in a tomb. And part of that process involved bringing ointment to anoint, to clean off, and then anoint the body, and then you wrap the body up. This is why when Lazarus came forward, Lazarus, after he came out walking, he had to be told, or Jesus had to tell people, yeah, get those grave clothes off him, because they had full on buried him. That was how they buried people, in a tomb.
Right, right.
Same thing with Jesus. Jesus was to be anointed. That's part of the reason some of these Marys came to find Jesus' body once they were cleared to do so after the Sabbath observance. They were coming to anoint the body. And so when this woman, Mary, she's anointing Jesus' live body with spikenard, Jesus was like, no, she's anointing my body for the burial. Y'all may not know this, but we're about 24 to 48 hours out. It's about to go down. And that's in
Yep.
Mark 14, verse 8.
Brother
Now,
Chris,
yes.
I've got working medical like I do, or have been for 20 years. We embalm bodies. They didn't do that back then. So think of the smell. One of the things for the anointing and using myrrh, using the spikenard or anything else, they did a blend, and it was to fight off the stink too. So physically, that's why they did it. Because if you went to the tomb, it was like, if you ever been around dead bodies, have been sitting around for days? Yeah. So that's part of it too. Just adding it.
All right. So this is good. We got a medical profession around. I don't know. I just assume it was all a spiritual or traditional thing, but the practical reason that does make sense to anoint a body so it didn't stink up the entire place. Tracking. Okay, so moving into verses 10 through 11, we have an identification of this betrayer, a guy named Judas Iscariot, one of the 12. Most of us know that. And what Judas does, as identified in verses 10 through 11 of Mark 14, is he goes off and he starts actively colluding with the chief priests. And what they want to do is they're planning a sting operation. I think most of us are familiar with the sting if we've seen police TV shows and court type law enforcement TV shows. A sting is when, law enforcement has been stalking and watching a certain criminal entity, and the day when they decide to bring in all the law enforcement professionals in for a single instance where they go to raid and arrest the criminals, it's called a sting. Well, that's what Judas is trying to set up, or what he is offered to help set up with the chief priests, because they've been after Jesus. They've wanted Jesus' head on a pike for a while. They wanted Jesus arrested and dead. And we even saw that in the first couple of verses of Mark 14. The only reason they weren't doing it now was because they didn't want any problems from the people during this sacred holy time. Well, the agreed upon price for Judas's betrayal, and Judas being the inside guy to tell on and give Jesus up, was going to be 30 pieces of silver. And one translation would say that while we see in our Bibles that there was a covenant made in between him, that covenant may indicate that they paid him right then and there. They gave him the money and said, all right, so we're going to see him at this time and place, right? And so Judas was actively trying to figure out, how am I going to, give Jesus up at this point? I got this money. I'm in it now. I made a deal. It is something in John 12:6, we see that Judas, while he observed Mary who anointed Jesus, he was not, though one of the people that brought up this argument about we could have given this money to the poor, John 12:6 makes it clear that he wasn't concerned about those poor people. He wasn't concerned about philanthropy. He wasn't concerned about missions and outreach. He only said that out loud, but on the inside, John calls Judas a thief. And that's why he was worried about where that money went. We find also in John 12 that Judas was also the guy in this roving missionary team called Jesus and His Disciples that was the treasurer. He had the money. So, if they need to make arrangements to, pay off a hotel bill for the entire group that's on this missionary excursion, Judas was the guy that wrote the check. Okay, so that's something. It is almost fitting that this guy that is a money grubbing or a super concerned with money type of dude is verbally chastising this woman that has tremendous value put on Jesus and his love for her and what's about to happen. And this is also the guy that is found to be a thief, and the guy that for some money would go and betray Jesus. Let's keep moving through Mark 14, verses 12 through 21. So in verse 12, we finally get to the first day of unleavened bread. Finally, all right. Verse 12, if you remember, we got to Bethany probably for the first time in Mark 11. So Jesus has been in the vicinity of Jerusalem for a while, got in the vicinity of Jerusalem because within the city limits of Jerusalem, he was going to observe the Passover. And out on that suburb, how about that, of Bethany, the city outside of Jerusalem, he's been going to and fro. Remember, on his travels to and fro from Bethany to Jerusalem, he saw the fig tree. Remember, on one of his travels from Bethany to Jerusalem, he came to Jerusalem, sits in the temple, and turned the temple upside down. Remember, on the way out of the temple, going back to Bethany, the disciple said, "Look at these great buildings." He's like, "Yeah, none of these stones are going to be left on top of another." This is all in this time frame, this couple of days time frame where Jesus is camped outside in the place called Bethany, prepared to get into the city of Jerusalem. Now, obviously, because there are people looking for Jesus in the city of Jerusalem, he's not going to be in Jerusalem for but so long, or for but so often. In verse 12, we find that the feast day of unleavened bread has finally come. And what happens is Jesus sends two of his guys out. Now, we don't know that these were one of the 12. These could have been other disciples that were with Jesus. He sends forth two men of his disciples. This is verse 13 of Mark 14. And he tells them to go into the city. Once they go into the city, what they're going to do is they're going to see a guy carrying some water. Once they see that guy carrying some water, follow the guy carrying water. The guy carrying water will go into a place. Go into that place, find the owner of the place, and tell him that the master wants to eat the Passover there. You hear how these instructions sound? This, if you were following Jesus in this time, you'd be like, can't we just go to the place? Why do we have to find the guy? Well, they followed instructions. They followed instructions, and that's what they did. They found the guy with the pitcher of water, and they went in, and what they told the guy, the owner of the facility, it says, the master saith, where's the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And so Jesus sent an envoy, an advent, an advance party before him to go and prepare an upper room so that he could come into the city with his disciples. Keep in mind, Jesus is a wanted man at this point. So he sent somebody ahead of him to find the facility and set it up so that whenever Jesus came into the city, straight there, go do the Passover. No questions, no looking around. He knows exactly where he's going. So that happens in verses 12 through 21. And this is around what we would call Thursday. And I say we would call Thursday because you got to remember, this is a Jewish culture and a Jewish celebration. And their days don't go like ours. Our days go from 12:01 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. That's the way our days go in 2021 if you're part of the Western culture. Well, in this time with these people, their days in an Eastern culture, it started in the evening and went to the following morning and sunup. It's consistent with the Genesis account where it says the evening and the morning were the first day. And so while we would call this Thursday, this is kind of a Thursday ordeal, but they're not going to eat the Passover until Thursday afternoon, evening to us, but to them, that's the dawning of Friday. Okay, all right, so here we go. In verse 18, we find that Jesus announces that he's going to be double-crossed and sold out by one of the 12, which is significant because one of the 12, Jesus makes a distinction in between his disciples, all the people that have been hanging out and have followed his teachings and at times actually follow him on foot around, and the 12 that he is hand selected. He says that he's going to be sold out, and what happens is the disciples one by one start asking Jesus, is it me? Is it me? This way, everyone's like, is it me? I need you to let me know now. Is it me? Am I going to do it? And this is something because you start to see how human these disciples are. So this is the deal. If you're moving around with Jesus in this time and place, and you know Jesus knows things that you don't know. Frankly, if you're a disciple, Jesus is talking a lot of stuff and a lot of it right over your head. You don't know a lot of stuff is going on. Read the gospel accounts. The disciples were lost kind of often. That being said, they get told that one of the disciples is going to betray Jesus. And if that were you, you might ask the same question. Well, Jesus, you know more than I do, and you can tell the future. Is it me? Because I don't know. I'm not sure. Is it an accident? Did I already say so? I don't know. And so they start asking Jesus, who is it? Each person asking for themselves. And this is something because it conveys an idea that the disciples assumed that the person that would betray Jesus might do it on accident and might do it of no volition of their own. Like whoever did it, maybe they couldn't help it. So let me ask, is it me? Or whoever did it, it's got to be an accident, right? Did I accidentally do it? That's what is conveyed here. And in verse 21, it gets different. Jesus kind of fixes that that presumption that an accidental, non-volitional thing. Verse 21 of Mark 14 says, well, the Son of Man is indeed going as it's written. So Jesus says that it's already written. God has already spoken. It's a done deal. So I'm going to go. That's a thing. And then he goes on to say in verse 21, but woe to the man. That means beware to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Good were it that man, if he had never been born. So Jesus conveys that while God has sovereignty, he has already spoken and his will has to be enacted, and that the Son of Man has to go to be crucified and betrayed and arrested and brought up on charges and slandered. All these things have to happen. There is also, even in this, human responsibility. There's woe to that person that chooses to do this. Beware. That one better beware, and it'd be better if that one will never come alive. That's what he said there. It'd be better for me if he had never been born. And so we see here that even the choice to betray Jesus was not something that was something that Judas couldn't help. Jesus said, he indicates that your choice, you better beware, because what you're going to do, it's better if you were never born. Now, some of us know the end of Judas Iscariot. We won't get into that here. But that is that particular section. In verses 22 through 25, as we continue in the same upper room discourse, we have the first instance of communion. Communion. I don't know any of the rest of the words. This is why I need my wife. She knows all the lyrics. All right. I play a horn, which means I don't have to talk through any song. But verses 22 through 25 record the first instance of communion, and it's communion to us, but to them, like I said, they were celebrating Passover. And so because they celebrate Passover on a certain day, we can assume that the sun had already gone down, and to them, Friday had started. Remember, Friday to them was sundown on our Thursday night, all the way through the morning and into the sun up. And so they're celebrating the Passover. This is the day when they are killing. This is the reason where disciples had to go prepare. They had to kill a lamb and eat the meal. And as they're eating the meal, Jesus does a couple of things to the bread and the wine. So they're eating the Passover meal. Jesus does a couple of things to the bread and the wine. He took the bread, blessed the bread, broke the bread, and he offered the bread to the people. Again, he took the bread, blessed the bread, broke the bread, and he offered it to the people. Remember, Jesus, at some point in John, he calls himself the bread of life. And so God took the bread, blessed the bread, broke the bread, and offered it to the disciples. And then with the wine, he took the cup. He gave thanks, and he offered the cup also to the disciples around him. I shouldn't have to paint all this. You get the imagery, with the bread representing Jesus' body, and with the blood representing and with the wine representing Jesus' blood. You see the parallels here, how we are invited into communion and how it is prepped for us, Jesus' body being taken from the heavenlies, blessed by God, of course, broken at the point of his crucifixion and offered to us to take part in. And of course, his blood being shed from his body, taken and given thanks. That is to say, thankfully recognizing that God is the one that has made this sacrifice and offered to us as well. We see these elements in the first communion. So while we read in Mark 14, verses 22 through 25, that everyone took part in consuming Jesus' broken body and his shed blood, we should remember a couple things. That the Jews at the time, and this is fun for me, because this is the cool stuff about the Bible when you look stuff in there. Remember, these were Jews at a Jewish celebration of God's liberation and deliverance from slavery. Remember in Exodus 12. That's where the first time this happened. So they're commemorating that event. And so these Jews at this Jewish commemoration, so they thought, were escorted by Jesus, a Jew, escorted from the Old Testament, Exodus 12, into the New Testament. Why do I say the New Testament? Because that's the way Jesus talks. verse 24 of chapter 14. What's he says? And he said, "This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many." And so Jesus, in a Jewish setting, he's escorting these Jews from the Old Testament right into the New. Now that's beautiful. Let's go into our study book here. On page 81, I would be pleased if one of you all would read the caption on page 81 called "The Lord's Supper."
Yes, sir. The Lord's Supper. Protestant Christians acknowledge two sacraments instituted by the Lord Jesus Christ: baptism and the Lord's Supper. Baptism relates to enters into the new covenant community, and Lord's Supper relates to ongoing participation in that community. Specifically, Lord's Supper is the church's way of regularly remembering and rejoicing in Jesus' sacrificial death on our behalf. And this is, of course, shown out through several segments here in Mark, and Luke, and Corinthians.
Yes, sir. All right. Let's keep kicking. You got to forgive me. I'm over smiling because if you could just imagine this, the Jews went hard for their old relationship with God as documented in the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Bible, wisdom literature, Psalms, prophecies, just a relationship that's very long standing. And Jesus, that is to say, God in the flesh, comes down and escorts them from this old covenant, this Old Testament, this old agreement of relationship into the New Testament, this new covenant. That's just beautiful. And if you're ever looking for a link to the Old Testament as a New Testament Christian, Jesus is the link. All right. So,
question, Brother Chris.
Sir.
So now here, I know we may not touch this part, but now Jesus here, he washes the feet of the disciples, something similar to what those 2 ladies did before. That's interesting. Just I wanted to bring that up. That's all.
Yes, sir. And for those that are listening, that is recorded in a different gospel, but that is an event that happened at this space as well. Yes, right in this instance, the same time frame. Now, as we move forward into verses 26 through 31, we see how they ended their time in this upper room. And they ended this time by, to say in verse 26, they sung a hymn and they went out. All right. So after all this is over, they had the foot washing. Thank you, Dr. Peters. They had the communion afterward. And Jesus also told them somebody's going to betray me. And it's one of the 12. They sung a hymn and they went on out into the Mount of Olives. Now, if you'll remember, I told you the Mount of Olives was a hilly area that was immediately to the east of the city of Jerusalem. And some of the maps that we have would put it kind of in between Bethany and Jerusalem. So as they went out into the Mount of Olives, they do get closer to Jerusalem, but it's kind of an evening and they're going out there. Jesus has them go out that way. Now, in verse 27, we see Jesus talking in a different manner. Things are going to kind of start to pick up here with regard to the intensity of the storyline. Jesus says that, all you are going to be offended because of me tonight. Like it's going down tonight, and you all are going to abandon me when they come for me. And offended is a word that if you were to do the word study, you'll find it means trapped up, like caught up, like snared. As in, you're going to get potentially snatched up, and because you get snatched up, you're going to run off. That was the understanding. So Jesus tells him, you're going to abandon me. And we got Peter. I like Peter, not because Peter was always right, but Peter, it just seems like his offness and his onness is just on open display throughout the biblical record. Peter objects again to Jesus. Sometimes I get irritated with Peter cutting Jesus off and telling Jesus what is and isn't the case. But we do that, so can't be too mad at Peter. Peter objects and says, no. Listen, I don't care if everybody else here abandons you, Pastor Jesus. I'm with you. Me and you in this thing together. I will not deny you for anything. Me and you we've been moving throughout this area together since we left John the Baptist and they arrested him. I've been here with you. I was there at the Mountain of Transfiguration. I know what you're about, and it's you and I. We together. Me and you shall never part. All that. He said, I got your back. I'm with you. You may not be able to count on them, but I'm your guy. Me and you, we together. All right. Regardless, don't care. All right. So that's what Peter's saying. And as Peter is a standout professing guy of his own loyalty to Jesus, Jesus has a response to him. He says, Peter, let me tell you something. Tonight, before the cock crows 2 times, you're going to deny me 3 times. And all the disciples continue to say the same thing. No, we're not going to abandon you. We're all with you. Yeah, Peter says he's with you. We're all with you. They're not coming to get you without us, Jesus. We got your back. We are going to make sure that we not only stick with you, but if it comes to it and we got to do some stuff, you know, maybe we have to do some stuff. I don't know if they went to the extent of violence. We do know Peter did. So it's something I take a lesson from this, and I encourage you to too, I encourage you let's take a lesson from this as well. As we consider Peter and how quick he was to jump out there and be like, oh, Jesus, hey, you talking about them. They might leave you, but I'm here to stay. We got to remember that Peter was the one that he was told by Jesus, well, you specifically are going to deny me in an especially egregious way. Remember in 1 Corinthians 10:12, this reminds me of that. It says that you got to watch out for those folks that think that they're good, because they can fall too. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. So you got to watch out for them. This is, you know, one of the missteps that Peter made, and it's telling and it's didactic for us. So after all the disciples are like, Jesus, we're not leaving for anything, we see in verses 32 through 42 of Mark 14, verses 32 through 42, we see that they get on the nearer side of the Mount of Olives. That is to say, the Mount of Olives that seems to be closer to Jerusalem, the city. Now, let's talk about this thing. This hilly area is called a Mount of Olives. And in other Gospels, it's called there's a garden there in the Mount of Olives, and it's called the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, whenever you make plants or whatever, you can put plants in a garden. But if you make a garden and the plant is grapes or olives, it's actually an olive orchard. And so what we're looking at is an olive orchard where Jesus has resorted with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. Okay, so this olive orchard or this garden is called Gethsemane. And what you'll look into is you'll find that the original language has this as a compound word that means the oil or ointment wine press, because Geth or Gath means press, like the way you press wine, the place, or the way you press oil to get press olives to get olive oil. I think you understand what I mean. You in a grape vineyard, you would take the grapes from the grape vineyard to the press, and in the press they'd be, you know, grind it out and get the grape juice out, and then you could have grape juice and or wine. But the process or the place is called the press, where the grapes get the wine or the juice out of the grapes. Same thing with an olive. With an olive, you press the olives to get the olive oil out of the olives. And so a press, gath, that term is combined with shemen or shemani, and shemen or shemani means oil or ointment. So Jesus, after leaving the Last Supper, as it's called, the first instance of communion, he goes to the Mount of Olives, and he's in an olive orchard called the sound check.
I can hear you.
Okay, maybe it was just me then. Okay.
Okay. All right. Because let's see here. All right. So Jesus, after leaving the Last Supper, went to a place called the Mount of Olives. And please let me know if my sound drops out or something. called the Mount of Olives. He's in a olive orchard that is called the oil press. So that's where Jesus is. This is the significance of the place, Garden of Gethsemane. All right, so Jesus goes there and he goes there to pray. We see that in verses 32 and 33 of Mark 14. He's there, he's praying, and we start to see some strange language for Jesus. Now, I have known Jesus in my studies thus far to be confident, sometimes a little disappointed in the disciples, but he's connected with the Father and he's confident. Here, we start to see some strange things. The language in verse 32 through 33 says, or the language in verse 34 says that Jesus was sore amazed and became very heavy. Yeah, so he posts the disciples up. That means puts them on duty, because as Jesus is going to pray, after telling his people that I'm going to be betrayed, he goes to pray in this oil press garden, and he posts his disciples, some of his most trusted, Peter, James, and John, and he becomes sore amazed and what's called very heavy in verse sore amazed and very heavy in verse 33. And we see that Jesus starts talking different. He says that his soul is exceeding sorrowful. And so this is different because we don't normally see this from Jesus. So there's some sort of an event happening to him at this oil press. Now, so amazed means greatly astounded and alarmed. Like something is very wrong and it is very obvious from looking at Jesus at this point. Very heavy mean he was extremely distressed. Extremely distressed, greatly troubled. I'm reading this and I start to look at this picture that the Bible paints of Jesus at this point, and I'm starting to wonder, is Jesus having a panic attack? Why is Jesus at this point in the oil press, this place of stress and pressing and crushing? Jesus starts to be astounded, amazed, distressed, and troubled, almost, that something is wrong at this point. In Luke 22, verse 43, we find that it's so bad that an angel shows up to strengthen Jesus. As if that's not backwards. Something is wrong in this garden. It is stressful at that point. We find that Jesus is in agony in Luke 22, verse 43. Jesus is he's in pain at this point, and the pain is so great to where his sweat drops like blood. Now, I don't know if Brother Mike is going to jump in on this, but a while ago, I went and Googled that. What do you mean Jesus sweated like drops of blood? And what I remember from the Google search is even today, there are documented cases of extreme press or extreme stress and psychological pressure that comes on humans, and somehow their blood vessels and their sweat glands amalgamate before the liquid leaves the skin. Brother Mike, is what I
Yes,
meant.
that is true. That is true. Many documented cases. In fact, even the church used some young ladies, seeing that happens. And you're right, it is stress. That can happen. And that is under extreme duress. Extreme. Yeah.
Extreme duress. So this is what's happening to Jesus in his garden. I don't know, maybe from my Sunday school, I got the wrong picture that Jesus casually walked into the garden and casually walked around and nicely, prayed on a rock and everything was sweet. The biblical picture, as this was a difficult, rough time. This was bad. Stuff was going down in that garden. And so as we consider this picture, we find that, Jesus being so grieved and such anguish that he compared, this is Jesus's words now, he compared his anguish and sorrow to death. This is Jesus. Jesus in verse 34, Mark 14 says, my soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death. And then he says, tarry here and watch. Tarry here and watch means wait here and pay attention to what's going on. You're on post, you're on duty. Look out for me. All right, Jesus is trying to get his prayers in. And Jesus sets up the disciples to be on the lookout. Now, this is something I, at this point, want to be, but I'll be disciplined, want to be a little bit irritated disciples, because the same disciples that a couple of verses earlier were cutting Jesus off and contradicting Jesus, saying, oh, we're not going to deny you. We're not going to offend you. We got your back, Jesus. They can't even stay awake to look out for a threat at this point. All right, let's go to the study book on page 78. Page 78. This gives us the clue as to what was going down, or what began to go down in that garden. Page 78, the first paragraph, if one of you all will read it, I'll answer it.
Yes, sir. It says, Jesus has just shared the cup of the new covenant with his disciples in Mark 14. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus then prays for the Father to take away this cup. The cup in Old Testament imagery represented God's wrath. What does this teach us about what Jesus is about to undergo?
Well, I would say the answer is in the question. If you look through those Old Testament references that are listed in this study guide in Isaiah and Jeremiah, you'll see that God's wrath is pictured as a cup that gets poured out. And so Jesus in the garden starts to ask if he can have this cup not happen to him, because clearly it's weighing on him. Clearly. That's part of why Jesus starts to say this prayer. If it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Jesus even invokes a term, Abba, Father. That is that term is an affectionate and intimate term that one says to their father. It's like saying daddy, or like saying papa, or something like that. It's not saying biological father, it's saying dad, please. Please, dad. When a child calls for his dad, hoping for some relief at the hand of his father, that's what Jesus was doing. And let me read verse 36. Jesus says, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt. Now, what we'll see here is that Jesus prays and goes away apart a little ways from the disciples 3 times. And he has to come back and awake the disciples 3 times. By disciples, we're talking about Peter, James, and John that were not able to stay awake. One of these instances, the first instance where Jesus comes back and finds the disciples sleeping after he told them to be alert while I go over here and pray because I'm having a hard time. Clearly, Jesus comes back in verse 37 straight to Peter. Remember, the one that opened his mouth and said, Jesus, I'm never going to leave you. I'm with you. I'm with you to the end. I'm right there with you. I'm loyal to the end. Me and you, ride or die. We in there, Jesus. Peter goes straight to him. Simon, are you sleeping? In verse 37. Peter comes back and says, Simon, are you sleeping right now? He says, you couldn't stay awake for 1 hour. You couldn't look out for me for 1 hour. In verse 38 says, listen, you need to be alert and you need to be praying right now. Unless you enter into temptation, that means so that you don't get tested as well. And he says, I'm tracking that your spirit may be ready, but that flesh is weak. The flesh, obviously, of the 3 disciples had them fall asleep. They were tired. So that
question point over here, please. He knew good and well he was going to go through with it, but he went ahead and asked it because of his humanness that's in him, and for us to know he still had a choice in the matter. Jesus. Second thing is, he knew good and well he was going to go through this because he drank of the cup with them and he told them, this is my body that is broken for you and my blood that is poured out for you. He knew good and well he was going to do it. And then he knew good and well this had to be done and he had to do it. And a wonderful thing that he taught us in the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done.
Amen. Great points. I'm going to reiterate those. It wasn't like Jesus was undergoing a type of torment that he didn't think going to happen. Remember, right before this, he just came from the Last Supper where he did what to that bread? He took it and he blessed it and he broke it.
Locked up.
Yeah. And so Jesus knew what was happening. Jesus also took of a cup. Jesus took of a cup that he indicated was filled with his blood. Now, Jesus knew that his blood was going to have to get shed. And so Jesus knew, well said. And then, Brother Peters also brought out that Jesus had a choice. That is correct. If you want a definitive proof that Jesus had a choice in what he did, that says right there, the end of verse 36, not what I want, but what you want. Jesus gave up his will. This is, I don't know, slap the table moment, drop the mic moment for Deacon Hawkins. This is, one of the big emboldened concepts in the Christian handbook of how to live like Jesus. Just memorize this phrase, not what I want, but what you want, to the will of the Father, and you're going to be all right for a lot of instances. That's what Jesus did in a time of anguish, in a time when, if any point in his life he had a reason to give up, it was there. We see some uncommon circumstances befalling Jesus at that point. We've never seen Jesus act like this. We've never seen Jesus respond like this. But it didn't matter how rough things got. He chose that after asking God, can we do different? Can we not do it this way? At the end of it, his thinking, his choice was, what you say goes, God. I got it. I want different, but not what I want, what you want. That was Jesus' resolution. Now, Jesus, at this point, and this is verse 42, he tells him, all right, listen, Jesus prayed 3 times, come back 3 times, finds him sleeping the whole time. The last time he's like, all right, let's get up. We got to go. They may have asked why, to which Jesus would have responded, well, the guy that's coming to betray us, he's moving right now. I can tell. Come on, let's go. That was verse 42. And in verses 43 through 51, what we have is this arrest situation. Now, again, in my youth, because, we tend to stream things down for the youth. And in Sunday school, I imagine it was like 2 or 3 dudes that came and arrested Jesus. I did. That's the way my imagination worked. That is not what the Bible says. It's not. What does that say? At verse 43, it says that immediately, this is right after Jesus says that the guy that's betraying me is at hand. It said, while he was speaking, Judas shows up. Almost on cue. He said, one of the 12, and he came with a great multitude, with swords and staves, from the chief priests and the scribes of the elders. Couple points there. First of all, this was not 2 or 3 guys. It's not like they sent a single police car with 2 officers to go get Jesus. Nah. Nah. We talked about them colluding to set up a sting. Seems like they sent about 1 or 2 teams from the city SWAT. It says a great multitude of people. If you were to check out John 18:3, you see that they sent a band of men. Now, if you know a couple things about the way the Roman armies were set up, a band of guys is not 2, 3 guys. It's a lot of dudes. It's a lot of guys out there that come and take them. And in John 18:3, it says they had torches. This almost makes me think like, why are they out there on this witch hunt in the dead of night to find and arrest Jesus? As a matter of fact, later Jesus asked the question, why are you coming to arrest me at night like this? Because Jesus knew, and he told them, and they knew, I was in the temple in broad daylight. You could have arrested me then. But you're out here at night with like a bunch of guys, swords and staves and torches out here, like I'm going to do something bad when Jesus hasn't harmed anybody. I mean, as long as we disclude egos. But Jesus hasn't harmed anybody. This is the way they went to arrest Jesus. And it's something because it says that this multitude in verse 43 was sent from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And so this was a band of people that was sent to go and arrest the guy, while there were some chief priests and scribes and elders, some of which stayed in the comfort of their own either homes or residences or the gathering at the chief priests. They sent out a bunch of guys, some hitters, to go and arrest a guy. Now, I'm in the military, and I know what it looks. I'm in the military. I know it looks like when you send out some guys to go and wrap a guy up. Keep in mind, we just finished the Iraq War, as you were. We have been involved in a war with Iraq and a war with Afghanistan. Somebody speaking?
Yeah, it's a mob. They sent a mob after him. Mob rule.
Yes. In addition to the mob, because there is there is a gospel account of bunch of folks showing up, there were also these, I say a band of men, one, because that's what John 18:3 says, but it also says like officers from the temple guard. So these were like day in and day out, their job was to be an armed man. Yes, but a bunch of folks, a mob came at them, torches. Really, as soon as I see torches, I'm thinking a mob. It's a mob, it's a bunch of people at night, and torches, it's a mob. It's probably a mob. What else are they gonna do? But verse 44, we see something that's ugly. We see Judas, he has to identify Jesus, which is something. For a while, I used to ask the question, what do they need Jesus to identify Jesus for? Because if Jesus was in the temple and these guys that wanted to arrest Jesus wanted to arrest him and they were sitting there glaring at him and having these debates with him, you know, these one-on-ones with, he's squaring off with Herodians and squaring off with Sadducees and squaring off with Pharisees in the temple, embarrassing all of them because they can't beat him in debate or theological discussion. They know what he looks like. Well, this may be indication that they sent the soldiers to get him, and the soldiers may not know what he looks like. That's possibly why Judas had to go directly to Jesus and identify him with the kiss. Once Judas identified him with a kiss, he'd be like, oh, that's the guy right there. Hem him up and take him. Now, I'll leave out one of my favorite elements of the story where they asked Jesus, are you Jesus of Nazareth? I'm going to leave that out. That's in John. And how when Jesus says, I am, the name of God, and Jesus says, I am, the whole band goes back and hits the ground. I'm gonna leave that out, all right? Because that's not Mark. All right, tracking. Mark 43, verse 44, we find that Judas identifies and betrays Jesus with a greeting of feigned intimacy, which is something. That
Hey,
means,
Brother Chris,
yes.
Brother Chris, just a quick one. I know you just want to leave it out there, but that's a pretty heavy one. So not only did they fall down, he says, okay, now come on, go ahead and arrest me. Let's get this thing over with.
So I'm trying to, I'll tell you this, gentlemen.
Thank you, Brother Sam. He was just going to drop that heavy one on us, and thank you.
And walk off. Deacon Hall, because I'm telling you, listen, I am a service member. If the boss says go wrap somebody up and bring him in, we go wrap somebody up and we bring him in.
Well done. Thank you, sir.
But if we go wrap somebody up to bring him in, and he says 2 words out of his mouth, and me and an entire squad or platoon fall to the ground, whoa, that's not natural. That's that we need to regroup. This is not going to work. Stop everything. So if you can imagine being a part of this guard from the temple, or being a Roman soldier at the time, attached to the temple, and they go to arrest someone that they probably don't even know. And they try to identify him and say, are you Jesus? And it says, I am. Just by saying the words, I am. Yeah, he might not have got arrested that night. We might have had to go back to the Humvee and call in and get some clarification, because that was not going to go down. But verse 44 of Mark 43 through 50.
Hang on, I got to drop this one too. Then, as if that wasn't enough, somebody slices up one of those guys' ears and he heals it right in front of them. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah. Yes. So here's what I'm trying to get to. We'll get back to slicing off the guy's ear. So they go to arrest Jesus. Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss or betrays him with a kiss. Here's what we should watch out from that. There are certain folks with feigned intimacy to Jesus, that through that intimacy, they are betraying Jesus and his purpose. Remember, there are folks that we know, sadly, sometimes even in a church setting, that with the appearance of closeness to God, and under the guise of that appearance or piousness or being super spiritual or being super devout or, a zealot, they do some of the most ugly stuff whenever it's found out or brought out later on. So I encourage us to assess people by their fruit, okay? Not be fooled by the appearance of things. The appearance was that Judas walked to his master and gave him a kiss. Reality was he just identified him to be arrested by a mob behind him. Verse 47 has the instance that brother Dr. Peter spoke of, where he says that one of them that stood by drew his sword and cut an ear off of a guy. I'm sorry, let me say what the King James Version says. And one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. All right. Now, in the Gospel of John, we find that this guy's name was Malchus that got his ear cut off. And the disciple that drew a sword was Peter. This is Peter. This is the one that professed his loyalty to a greater degree of explicitness than the rest of the disciples. Said, I'll never leave you. I'm going to be with you till the end. I'm with you. The guy that later on couldn't stay awake to be alert. And then at the point where he sees, oh, they coming to get him? Are we doing this? Are we doing this? He pulls out a sword. And if you'll watch my hand motion, cuts off a guy's ear. Now, I've had a sword once or twice. And vertical strikes are not the most common in the world. But if you were to slice off a person's ear in one foul swoop, because it couldn't have been a slicing, who's going to let that happen? It had to be a like so, right? Because the person ducking would do this, right? And when you do this action, now your head's at the right angle for a sword to chop that bad boy off. But if you imagine that, because in the throes of someone being arrested and you looking like you're going to have to fight, because a mob is approaching with staves and swords, and someone rips out their sword out of their sheath and takes a swipe. One imagines, if that's the case, and this is all imaginative, this is speculation, if this was the motion, Peter might not have been aiming for that ear. Peter might have been aiming to take somebody's head off. This is a might. This is not in the Bible. This is just my imagination going. Well, what is there is that Jesus, in the Gospels, he says, listen, Peter, let this happen. The way, Brother Peter had indicated in John, we have that Jesus takes the ear, puts it back on the guy, and it's good, which also should have been stunning to those that are trying to arrest Jesus. We have to take the understanding that we should not be trying to beat people up to defend Jesus. That's where Peter messed up there. That's where Jesus would say elsewhere in the Gospels that those that take up the sword, you're going to be subject to it. Or in today's terminology, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. The point is, we should not be trying to fight people, like physically fight them or slander their name to defend Jesus in argument. Jesus willingly undergoes this persecution associated with the will of God. And where Peter was off was that he tried to impede that. He wasn't just impeding, trying to stop Jesus from getting arrested. What Peter was impeding and messing up was God's will. So that's a note to us. You'll see that, Peter cutting off Malchus's ear is documented in John chapter 18, verses 10 through 11. Verse 50 puts it to us to where it wraps up this idea that's been put out there throughout the rest of 14. Verse 50 says, and they all forsook him and fled. That means Jesus was with a bunch of guys that had said, disciples that had said, we're not leaving you for anything. Specifically, Peter that says, I will not leave you. I don't care if it comes down to my own death. I'm not leaving you. Verse 50 of Mark 14 says, and they all forsook him and fled. So when Jesus said, all y'all going to be offended at me this night, in Mark chapter 14, verse 27, he was right. They all left. They all took off. So as we move into that, we see verse 51 through 52. Now, verses 51 through 52 are unique to Mark in that they're not documented elsewhere, and they talk about some young man. Verses 51 through 52 of Mark chapter 14 say that there was a certain young man that followed him, and he had a linen cloth across his naked body, and when some guys tried to arrest him, he got out of there and did a wriggle move, and boom, they got his clothes, but he's free, so he took off naked. And that's unique here, and this is why a number of academics believe that this is Mark telling on himself. A lot of people believe, and this is not cemented, but a lot of people believe that in 51 through 52, we see that the young man, Mark, the writer of the Gospel Mark, John Mark, they think that Mark is talking about himself right here because this is the only gospel that records this. And Mark had to be a young guy because we know more about John Mark's involvement with the church, being an understudy of Peter and being one that traveled with Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journeys. We find that Mark was not apart from this Christian movement. You know, we find that even Peter went to John Mark's mother's house whenever he was released from prison by an angel. And so a number of people believe that this is an indication of how Mark was involved with Jesus at the time. Is it set anywhere? Is it proven? No. This is just what some people believe. They think it's a clue. Well, in verse 53, and in the next section, verses 53 through 65 of Mark 14, we find that Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin. That means the boss and the shot callers that sent that mob to go and snatch Jesus out of the Garden of Olives in the dead of night. The mob, or as you were, the arresting officers, the actual guys that were actually on duty with swords that were supposed to arrest him, they dragged him to the chief priest's house. And there it is found that the Sanhedrin has assembled itself. The Sanhedrin has assembled itself. If I could have one of the participants read on page 82 of our study books, a quick recap, an identification of what or whom the Sanhedrin are. It's at the bottom of page 82, says Sanhedrin. If you could read that, that'd be great.
Yes, sir. I lost you on audio, but if you're speaking of number 4 on the bottom of the page, Sanhedrin,
Yes,
it says either local Jewish tribunal, which is a council. It is found in Matthew, or as here, the supreme ecclesiastical court in Jerusalem. These Jewish leaders included elders, chief priests, and scribes.
Yes, sir. So the Sanhedrin is the getting together of the leaders of the Jewish faith, top dogs. We're talking chief priest or the high priest a term ago, the high priest from potentially 2 terms ago, the higher priest, that is to say chief priests. Pharisees should be there, Sadducees are going to be there, scribes. These are the leaders of the Jewish faith at the time, and these are the most powerful people over the area because the city is Jerusalem, and the population there is predominantly Jewish. Rome is there, but they're just an occupying military party. The Jews are running the day-to-day. Okay, and so this Sanhedrin is an extremely powerful Jewish tribunal. It's not just like a couple of guys get together from a village. This is the big city, and this is the shot callers, the most important, powerful people in the city associated with the Jewish faith have come together, and they are all there when they hear that they finally got Jesus and they arrest him. He's over at the chief priest's house. We're going now. And what they begin to do is they hold their own court there, because the Jewish faith, they managed themselves in a lot of instances. And so they started on a court, and what they want to do, as we've seen repeatedly in the Gospel of Mark, is that they're trying to bring Jesus up on charges. They want to get him, and we need to find something here. We got him arrested finally. There was a lot of places where we couldn't, but we got him arrested finally. So now let's charge him. What you got? Come on, get behind the mic, get on the witness stand, tell me what you got. They start calling forward these witnesses, and they were like, you tell me what he did. That one right there, tell me what he did. Listening, and they keep listening to these different witnesses, but the problem is they got all these, liars coming through with all these false testimony because they knew that this would please the Sanhedrin. But their witnesses, their testimonies didn't agree. Like, they couldn't corroborate each other because none of them quite matched. And so that's kind of hard. You're looking for 3 or 4 guys to say that this person that you're trying to convict, this person, the man Jesus from Nazareth, the tribunal is trying to convict him of a religious crime, be it a blasphemy, specifically is what what they want to convict him of. And we found elsewhere in the Gospels that the reason they wanted to convict him is because he was causing a stir in the people and a threat to their power. But they're looking for witnesses that would give some matching testimony so they could say, you know what, because y'all said the same thing, it's got to be true. This guy, you are hereby charged with A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. They couldn't find witnesses to match. That means the witnesses would come up and say stuff that had nothing to do with the prior witnesses, nor the following witnesses' testimony. It was just all a bunch of incoherent, unfitting lies. And it's interesting to me that in this instance, we find that Jesus is not responding to these folks, these false witnesses. Where am I here? In verses 57 through 59 of Mark 14, we see that there are false witnesses that show up and they say some things, but their witness doesn't agree with each other. Verses 60 through 62 has Jesus not speaking to them, like he's not addressing the lies. He's not addressing the confusion. He's not addressing all this, just throwing stuff out there to get Jesus. He's not addressing that. He's not dealing with it. He's not. And we find that following in verse 65, he does address a certain person. I'm sorry, he does address someone in verse 62, but that's a different question. That's a different topic. That's a different concept. And so I have to be careful whenever I sing certain hymns and I take with a certain understanding. If I say things like, he never said a mumbling word, I got to be careful with that because he definitely spoke in verse 62. What is apparent here is that Jesus didn't tend to speak to things that were immaterial or things that were false, because clearly these false witnesses in verse, let's see what we got here. In verse 57, they rated no response. They rated no response from Jesus, because in verse 62, when a certain person gets up and speaks, that is to say, when the high priest speaks, that is to say, the authority in the room gets up and speaks, and he asks a question with regard to Jesus' identity as the Messiah, the Christ. That's a question Jesus is ready to talk about. Okay, that's what I'll deal with. All this false business, and but the high priest gets up and is like, what is going on here? Why are you quiet? Is what the high priest says. Like, how are you keeping quiet when all these people are saying this stuff about you? Got us doing all this hard work trying to put together a case from you. Why are you so quiet anyway? Are you the Messiah or not? That's what the high priest asked Jesus. And Jesus was like, all right, well, there's a question I'll answer for you. In verse 62 of Mark 14, Jesus says, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, you can turn to Daniel 7:13 and you can see the imagery, but it is clear from Jesus' words that not only has Jesus admitted to being the Messiah, but he has admitted to being the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy of the divine king of the Jews, the divine one that is given a kingdom. This is also in Daniel 7. And the one that will come in the clouds of heaven. So in this statement, Jesus has made it clear. And by clear, I mean he's not using parables. There's no cryptic speech. He has said it out loud in front of everybody. I am the Messiah. He says, I am, and you're going to see the Son of Man, that is to say, the king given a kingdom, power, and glory. From Daniel 7, you're going to see him coming in power, and you're going to see me coming in the clouds of heaven. He says that. Well, the high priest is finally like, all right, well, there we go. That's it. What do you think? We heard out of his own mouth. That's it right there. And so they condemned him and called him guilty of death. That's what they were looking for the whole time. They were looking for the right words to use against Jesus. And it turns out that someone with an ill intent asked Jesus a question that is something that we should all know. Asked Jesus a question that was a saving message. He took it and he condemned Jesus to death for it. Now,
Chris, 1 second.
Yes.
Very interesting thing here. A lot of people miss is there were two high priests there at that time. One was Ananias and one was Caiaphas.
One was the dad, one was the kid, right?
And then the other thing is, there was a third high priest, and that was Jesus. That was at the same time. Next interesting point. With what was being said, the Old Testament law said uh, one of the conditions of a high priest is when he is in session or when he is in position of high priest, he cannot tear his clothes. And this guy in another place, he ripped his garments. Okay, so now another interesting piece to this whole thing is Jesus, being the high priest, his garment was never ripped. His garment was made of one piece, and when they cast lot for it at the foot of the cross, they said, hey, this is a fine garment. Let's not tear this. Look at how God's word is so perfect.
That's good. Goodness.
And one other thing is, how did he
Hey,
answer?
Minister, I just wanted to put
He
out
answered
to
as
everyone.
he answered, I am. The same I am that Jehovah, Yahweh, in the Old Testament, he said, I am that I am. So he was saying, I am God. Not just the Messiah, but God also. And that's why they said that was blasphemy for someone who they perceived to be a man was calling himself God.
Amen, Brother Mike.
Hey, gents, please let's allow the minister to stay on video alone, and we all stay off because it started to kind of hinder our comms, and everybody's starting to cut in and out. So let's keep him on video and everyone else stay off video.
Yes, sir. Brother Mike, the I am statement. I was one to pay attention to how seldom Jesus used those words. That's why it got me whenever I saw in John that there are rare times when Jesus, because they're asking Jesus about his identity throughout his entire ministry, and he picks his words and he chooses when he says those words right there, because that is a confession. The Jews would hear that. To us, to non-Jews, it's a dog whistle, to where you would have to be in or a student or studying Jewish culture to know it. But to all them, that was on loudspeaker. You don't say that unless you mean it has a divine implication. So you're right, Brother Mike. And then Brother Samuels, that's also beautiful. Because for a while I was like, what is the deal with Jesus' clothes never being ripped? What's that about? Why? What's so good about these clothes to where guys that are paid well from the Roman army are casting bets trying to figure out who's going to get his garments? Jesus wasn't rich when he walked earth. It wasn't like a coat of many colors or anything, but that is a great point. The high priest, he ripped his own clothes. And so we see who was the false and who was the real. Noted. All right, so verse 65, and we need to move a little bit. Verse 65, don't hold back your comments. Verse 65 of Mark 14, it seems to be the green light. After they condemn him to be guilty, you start to see what I don't want to say the tradition, the understanding is that once somebody's condemned guilty and guilty of death, you could treat him as bad as you want to. And that's ugly. You see that he's tried up to this point, but in verse 25, the floodgates are open and they just get ugly in that room. It gets ugly. Verse 65 of Mark 14 says they start to spit on him. Now, in our culture, somebody spits on you means they think very, very little of you. Very little of you. They spit on him, they cover his face and start to buffet him, push him around and impeding him, bullying him, to one of the worst degrees. They say unto him, prophesy, who hit you? Who hit you? Who hit you? Doing things that we would imagine that, bad little kids do to bully another kid on the playground, but they're doing this as grown folks, and it's a lot more violent. They're doing this in the presence of this Jewish tribunal. This is what they're doing. Jewish tribunal of religious folks. And now we're starting to see folks as true colors. We start to see them come through what they really wanted to do to him. It says the servants, they started hitting Jesus with the palms of their hands, literally smacking him around. This happened again at night in what I call a kangaroo court. That's why I would say that. Now, the last part of Mark 14, it paints Peter, and it is the realization of Jesus' prophecy that Peter would deny Jesus thrice. So we can move smoothly through this, and then Our Language, My Time will probably have some more input from some of you all. Verses 66 through 72 have Peter in a certain place while Jesus did flee. He did scatter because all forsook him, according to biblical record. Jesus did kind of follow, Peter, as you were. Peter did kind of follow, and he got near the area trying to figure out what's going on with Jesus. I believe Peter did love Jesus. He was faulted, but he did love Jesus. He ran away. He had to get out of Dodge because this arrest was going on. This was all bad. But, from a distance, he kind of sneaking around trying to figure out what's going on because he wanted to see what was going to come of his master. And what Peter does is he gets around and he starts to deal with certain people around the estate in which this kangaroo court, this trial of Jesus is happening. At night, he gets around a fire and begins to warm his hands. And when warming himself, there was one that was there. It says there was, one of the maids of the high priest. So that means one of the, female servants of the high priest. Keep in mind, if you're a high priest, that means a lot of power, a lot of money. So you got a whole staff of butlers and maids. One of them saw Peter and says, "Oh, no, hey, you were one of them that was with Jesus in Nazareth." Remember, Jesus was popular. And when you're popular and you have a posse, people are going to see you and your posse. And so this maid was around and she knew some things. She's like, "Weren't you with Jesus at some point?" And of course, Peter, he denies Jesus. And the maid saw him again and began to tell folks around. And then Peter denies it again. And this time, after that second denial, they're like, "Nah, you were with Jesus because Jesus is from Nazareth, the city, and Nazareth is in Galilee, and you talk just like you from Galilee. Your speech is giving you away." This is like, someone trying to say that they weren't with a popular person from Louisiana when they sound like they're from Louisiana. No, you sound like you're from Louisiana, or someone that, is from Boston, or I don't know how they say Boston, but, someone from Boston and is a popular person from Boston. Like, I never knew that guy from Boston, like, but you sound like you're from Boston. I can hear it. I hear the way you're talking. And they said to Peter, "Your speech sounds like you're from Galilee." And Jesus, and Peter, he curses and says, "No, I'm telling you, I don't know who you're talking about." Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And after those 3 denials, the cock crows twice, and Peter remembers what Jesus told him. That before that cock crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times. That is the end of Mark 14. I'm going to relinquish my time to the moderator, and from then, I'm pretty sure we'll have some discussion on Mark 14.
Thank you, Minister.